The VIP lounge doors glided open with a heavy, weighted silence that felt louder than a crash. The sudden hush reverberated through the dim space, silencing every whisper, every clinking glass. Heads turned in unison. Even the bouncers froze. He entered like a shadow given form, tall, broad-shouldered, flanked by two men whose dark suits were so precisely tailored they might as well have been armor. But it was the man in the center who commanded every breath in the room. His suit was midnight navy, the kind of fabric that whispered of obscene, untouchable wealth, and his dark hair was swept back from a face that belonged on a sculpture, all sharp angles and cold, aristocratic beauty. But it was his neck that made my stomach drop. Beneath the crisp, unbuttoned collar of his shirt, black ink curled upward, the jagged tail of something lethal, something deliberately displayed. A dragon. The mark of the Kongpei, the Korean syndicates I'd only ever heard of in terrified whispers. This wasn't just a club owner. This was Song Ji-won, the man who owned the city's secrets. The scent of expensive orchids was a poison I couldn't escape. It was thick and cloying in the gala air, smelling less like a celebration and more like the flowers at a funeral. My fingers trembled around the stem of a crystal flute, borrowed like the shimmering red velvet gown I wore, as the laughter of the elite swelled for a man who had just erased me from his life. Every clink of silverware was an accusation. Every second of silence from the friends who had turned their backs on me was a knife between my ribs. I checked my phone hidden in my clutch. The notification burned like a brand. Credit limit exceeded. Partner access revoked. My breath caught. This wasn't just a breakup. This was a social execution. My mentor, Min-hee, materialized at my elbow, her face a mask of pity. He's already announced the merger, Shania. Not just the business, the marriage to the heiress. You need to leave before the security escort finds you. I didn't need to hear more. I'd known the moment I walked in and felt the wrongness in the air, the way the ballroom light seemed too sharp, too eager to see me fall.
The air in the VIP lounge of the Obsidian was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco, and a silence so heavy it felt subterranean. I stumbled through the velvet curtains, my lungs burning as if the very atmosphere of the gala downstairs had been oxygen depleted. My red velvet gown, once a symbol of my triumph, now felt like a shroud of my public execution. I could still hear the muffled echo of the orchestra, a mocking soundtrack to the moment my fiancé had looked through me as if I were a ghost he'd already exorcised. I didn't notice the man at first. He was a part of the shadows, seated in a high-backed leather chair that faced the floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the neon pulse of Seoul. The bar is closed to the public, a voice drawled. It was a low, melodic rasp that sent a shiver down my spine. Not of fear, but of a strange, sudden grounding. I'm not the public, I snapped, the gin and the heartbreak finally boiling over into a reckless, jagged edge. I moved toward the shadow, my heels sinking into the plush carpet. I'm the woman who just lost everything in front of 500 people. I think that earns me a drink. The chair rotated slowly. Song Ji-won didn't rise. He simply sat there, a glass of amber liquid in one hand, his dark eyes tracking my disheveled elegance with a terrifying level of focus. The unbuttoned collar of his shirt revealed the black ink of a dragon's tail, creeping up his neck like a silent warning. Up close, his beauty was aristocratic and lethal, a face carved from ice and ancient secrets. I didn't stop until I was standing directly in front of him, my knees nearly brushing his. The air between us grew hot, charged with the kind of forced proximity that made my pulse erratic. I leaned down, my hands trembling as I gripped the arms of his chair, invading his personal space because I had nowhere else to go. "They say you're the man who can make things happen," I whispered, the scent of his sandalwood cologne and the cold night rain clinging to him. "They say you own the secrets of every man who thinks he's untouchable." Ji-won tilted his head, his gaze dropping to my lips before returning to my eyes. He reached up, his thumb grazing the line of my jaw with a touch that was both a caress and a claim. "And what does a girl in a red dress want with secrets, Shania?" "I don't want secrets," I breathed, my face inches from his. "I want him to look at me and feel the floor give way. I want him to regret every second he spent breathing without me. Make him regret leaving me." A dark, slow smile ghosted across Ji-won's lips. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned forward, his breath ghosting over my skin. Revenge is an expensive habit, Dullin. Are you prepared to pay the price for my shadow?
The transition from the shadows of the lounge to the blinding glare of the ballroom felt like a descent into a different kind of hell. But this time, I wasn't walking into the fire alone. Jiwon's hand was a warm, heavy weight against the small of my back, his palm resting possessively against the silk of my gown. He didn't just walk, he reclaimed the space, the crowd parting before him like a dark tide. "Chin up, Shania," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that only I could hear. "You aren't a victim anymore. You are my interest, and I protect my investments." The gala was in full swing, the air buzzing with the news of my ex-fiancé's strategic engagement. But as we stepped onto the main floor, the music seemed to falter. The whispers died in the throats of the city's most powerful people. Sung Ji-won didn't attend events like this. He was the ghost story they told to keep their children and their accountants in line. To see him here was a shock. To see him with me was a scandal that redefined the social hierarchy in a single heartbeat. I saw Minho across the room, his arm draped around the heiress. He was laughing, the picture of a man who had successfully traded up. Then his eyes found mine. The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might collapse. His gaze dropped to Jiwon's hand on my waist, then to the unbuttoned collar of Jiwon's shirt, where the dragon tattoo whispered of a violence Minho couldn't even fathom. Jiwon didn't wait for an introduction. He led me directly to the center of the floor, stopping only when we were inches away from my ex. The silence was absolute, a vacuum of opulent dread that sucked the oxygen from the room. "Minho," Jiwon said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. He didn't offer a hand. He simply stared, his dark eyes stripping away Minho's carefully constructed arrogance. "I believe you've met your companion, though I hear you were foolish enough to let her go." Minho stammered, his eyes darting toward the exits. "Jiwon, I didn't know you and Shania were acquainted." "Acquainted?" Jiwon's thumb traced a slow, deliberate circle against my hip, a public mark of ownership that made my skin flush. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a lethal purr that echoed through the silent hall. "She is the only thing in this room worth more than your life. If I see you in her orbit again, I won't just take your reputation. I'll take everything you think makes you a man." He turned me away then, not giving Minho the dignity of a response. As we walked toward the exit, I felt the shift in the atmosphere. The pity was gone, replaced by a terrified, breathless awe. The price of my soul had been paid in public, and as the heavy doors closed behind us, I realized I was no longer a discarded bride. I was the property of a king. The ride to the estate was a descent into a world where the laws of the city ceased to exist. I sat in the back of the darkened sedan, the leather cool against my legs, while Jiwon remained a silent, brooding presence beside me. He didn't speak, but the air in the car was thick with the aftershock of our encounter at the gala. Every time the streetlights flickered across his face, I saw the hard, uncompromising lines of a man who didn't just participate in the world, he dictated it. We passed through a series of reinforced steel gates, guarded by men who didn't look like bouncers, but like soldiers. When the car finally stopped, I stepped out into the courtyard of a sprawling fortress of black stone and glass, hidden deep within the secluded hills of Bukchon. It was a masterpiece of opulent dread, where traditional eaves cast long, pointed shadows like teeth against the moonlit sky. "This isn't a home," I whispered, my voice caught in the back of my throat as I looked at the armed men stationed on the perimeter. "This is a command center." Jiwon walked toward me, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his white shirt glowing against the darkness. "The Obsidian is where I entertain the public, Shania. This is where I rule." He led me through a massive foyer of polished basalt. On the far wall, a crest was etched in silver, a coiled dragon identical to the ink on his neck. My breath hitched. I knew that symbol. It was the mark of the Lim Syndicate, the legendary organization that controlled every dock, every construction contract, and every silent heartbeat in the capital. The man I had begged for revenge wasn't just a powerful club owner. He was the apex predator of the Korean underworld. He stopped in front of a wide window overlooking the glowing veins of the city below. "You asked me to make him regret leaving you," he said, turning to face me. The forced proximity was back, his shadow swallowing mine as he stepped into my space. He reached out, his fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of my neck,
pulling me just close enough to feel the heat radiating from his chest. Minho is a mosquito, Shania. I could crush him tonight. But you didn't ask for his death. You asked for his regret. And for that, you have to stay here, in the dragon's nest, until the city forgets you ever belonged to him. And if I want to leave? I breathed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Jiwan leaned down, his lips brushing against my ear, his voice a low, possessive growl. You walked into my shadow and made a pact. The exit was behind you the moment you whispered my name. You're in my world now, and I don't let go of what's mine.
The following morning, the dragon's nest transformed from a fortress into a gilded dressing room. Song Ji-won did not do things by halves. At his command, a fleet of stylists and couriers arrived, bearing trunks of silk, leather, and jewels that cost more than the apartment I had shared with Minho. I stood in the center of a massive walk-in closet lined with smoked glass, feeling less like a woman and more like a blade being polished for a singular, lethal purpose. Ji-won sat in a plush armchair in the corner, a glass of dark tea in his hand, watching the transformation with the clinical eye of a diamond merchant. He didn't offer praise, he offered corrections. Too soft, he remarked as a stylist held up a blush-toned lace dress. She isn't a debutante. She is the woman who is going to make the elite of this city fear their own reflection. He rose and walked toward me, motioning for the stylist to retreat. From a velvet-lined box, he withdrew a necklace of black diamonds, the stones catching the morning light like frozen drops of oil. The forced proximity was a physical weight as he stepped behind me. I felt the heat of his body, the faint scent of sandalwood, and the terrifyingly steady rhythm of his breathing. As he draped the cold gems against my throat, his fingers lingered against my skin, his touch a possessive brand. "Power isn't just about who you know, Shania," he whispered, his reflection over my shoulder looking like a dark god. "It is about the atmosphere you create when you enter a room. Minho and his circle thrive on your shame. We are going to replace that shame with a vanity so sharp it will draw blood." He handed me a tablet. On the screen was a list of names, the socialites who had laughed the loudest at my downfall, the investors who had pulled their support the moment the engagement was announced. Beside each name was a figure, their debt, their scandals, their secret holdings. "Tonight is the opening of the Kim Gallery," Ji-won said, his thumb grazing the dragon's tail on his neck. "You will go, you will wear these stones, and you will use this data to dismantle the woman who tried to replace you. I have given you the ammunition. Do not miss." I looked at my reflection, the sleek bun, the dark diamonds, the cold fire in my eyes, and realized the girl who had cried in the VIP lounge was dead. Ji-won hadn't just dressed me, he had armed me. I wasn't just his interest anymore. I was his most beautiful weapon. "I won't miss," I promised, my voice a low, steady echo of his own. Ji-won leaned down, his lips ghosting over my temple. "Good, because I don't keep weapons that don't cut." The aftermath of the gallery opening felt like a fever dream. I had dismantled my rivals with a few whispered sentences, watching their faces drain of color as I wielded the secrets Ji-won had gifted me. But the adrenaline had left me cold, and as the heavy doors of the estate closed behind us, the silence of the dragon's nest felt suffocating. I found Ji-won in the private study, the room illuminated only by the amber glow of a dying fire. He was stripped down to his shirt sleeves, the fabric clinging to the powerful tension in his shoulders. He didn't turn when I entered, but I felt the pull of his presence like a magnetic north. I moved toward him, my silk gown whispering against the floor, until I was standing close enough to see the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. The aristocratic mask was gone, replaced by something raw and dangerous. "You were effective tonight," he said, his voice a low vibration in the dim light. I heard the whispers. "You didn't just cut them, you bled them dry." "I did what you taught me," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. "But I realized tonight that power has a cost. I saw the way people looked at you when you walked me to the car. It wasn't just respect, it was terror." Ji-won finally turned, and the forced proximity became a suffocating heat. He reached up to unbutton the top of his shirt, his movements slow and deliberate. As the fabric fell away, the dragon on his neck was fully revealed, its scales spiraling down his chest in a dark, intricate web of ink. But it wasn't just a tattoo. As I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat, I saw the raised, jagged lines of scar tissue woven into the design, reminders of blades and bullets that the ink had tried to hide. "You see the dragon, Shania, but you don't see the price of the throne," he whispered,
his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. He took my hand and pressed my fingers against the ink, forcing me to feel the rough texture of the scars beneath. Every inch of this map was paid for in blood. This isn't a fashion statement. It's a ledger of survival. The terror you saw tonight is the only thing that keeps the vultures from tearing this house down. The reality of his world crashed over me. The opulent dread wasn't just a style, it was a necessity. He wasn't just a boss, he was a survivor who had branded himself with his own history. My fingers lingered on his skin, the heat of his body seeping into mine. In that moment, the fear I had felt for him transformed into something far more dangerous, a fierce, protective ache. "I'm not afraid of the dragon," I breathed, my face inches from his. Jiwan's hand tangled in my hair, pulling me flush against his chest. "You should be," he growled, his lips ghosting over mine. "Because once you know the man beneath the ink, there is no turning back."
The rain-slicked pavement outside the obsidian shimmered like oil under the neon signs, mirroring the instability of the man standing in my path. Minho looked pathetic. The polished socialite I had once planned to marry was gone, replaced by a man whose eyes were bloodshot and whose hands shook as he reached for me. He had seen me draped in Jiwan's black diamonds. He had seen the city's elite bow to me, and the coward's regret I had prayed for was finally rotting him from the inside out. "Shania, wait," he gasped, stumbling forward. "I made a mistake. The engagement, it's a business arrangement, nothing more. My family, they forced my hand. But seeing you with him, it's killing me. You don't know what he is. He's a monster, Shania. You're in over your head." I stopped, the silk of my trench coat billowing in the wind. I didn't feel the old sting of his betrayal. I felt a cold, clinical detachment. "You didn't seem concerned about my safety when you revoked my bank access and left me to the vultures, Minho." "I can fix it," he pleaded, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. He reached out to grab my arm, his fingers fumbling for the skin Jiwan had claimed just hours before. "Come back to me. I'll break the merger. The air suddenly went dead. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as a heavy, silent shadow materialized behind me. Jiwan didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The sheer gravity of his presence made Minho freeze, his hands stopping inches from my sleeve. Jiwan stepped around me, moving with a predatory grace that turned the sidewalk into a hunting ground. He didn't look at Minho with anger. He looked at him with the boredom of a man deciding whether or not to crush a bug. He reached out and gripped Minho's wrist, his fingers tightening with a slow, bone-deep pressure that forced the younger man to his knees. "I believe I gave you a warning, Minho," Jiwan whispered, the dragon on his neck appearing to writhe as he leaned down. "I told you that if I saw you in her orbit again, I would take everything." "Jiwan, please, we're from the same circles," Minho whined, his face contorting in pain. "We are not in the same circle," Jiwan growled, his voice a low, lethal vibration. He pulled Minho closer, his free hand hovering near the unbuttoned collar of his own shirt. "She isn't a prize you can reclaim when your ego is bruised. She is mine. And in my world, we don't return what belongs to the king." Jiwan looked back at me, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of hesitation. Finding none, he turned his gaze back to the shivering wreck at his feet. "Run," he commanded, a single sharp word that carried the weight of an execution. As Minho scrambled away into the darkness, Jiwan turned to me, his possessiveness flared and raw. He pulled me into his chest, his hands anchoring me to him as if I might vanish into the rain. "Tell me," he rasped, his forehead resting against mine. "Do you still want him to regret it, or are you ready for him to disappear?"
The grand crystal hall was a cathedral of light, but tonight the air felt like a held breath. I walked beside Jiwan, my fingers tucked into the crook of his elbow, feeling the coiled tension in his frame. We were no longer just a rumor, we were the epicenter of the city's gravity. He wore a tuxedo that seemed carved from the midnight sky, but as he leaned down to whisper a comment about the vintage of the wine, his eyes never stopped tracking the perimeter. "Stay close," he murmured, his thumb grazing my wrist. "The atmosphere is too thin tonight." He was right. The explosion didn't start with a sound, but with the sudden, violent shattering of the skylight. Shards of glass rained down like lethal diamonds, screaming through the air. The music died in a discordant screech as masked men in tactical gear breached the balconies. Panic, sharp and metallic, flooded the room. Before I could even gasp, Jiwan's arm was a band of iron around my waist. He didn't flee. He moved with a terrifying, calculated precision. He spun me behind a marble pillar, his body shielding mine so completely that I was enveloped in the scent of his cologne and the heat of his skin. The forced proximity was no longer a game of seduction. It was a barrier against death. "Look at me, Shania," he commanded, his voice a low, steady anchor amidst the gunfire and the screams. He ignored the chaos behind him, his focus entirely on my face. He reached up, his hands cupping my cheeks, his thumbs stroking my skin with a desperate, raw possessiveness. "Don't look at them. Look at me." A stray bullet chipped the marble inches from his head, but he didn't flinch. His eyes were dark, burning with a fire that went beyond the duty of a protector. In the wreckage of the gala, the truth laid itself bare. He wasn't protecting an interest or a weapon. He was protecting his heart. "You are mine," he growled, his forehead crashing against mine as his men moved to neutralize the threat. "Do you understand? No one takes what is mine. Not the law, not the rivals, and certainly not the grave." He pulled a sleek silver handgun from his waistband, his gaze shifting to the intruders with a lethal, predatory light. But even as he prepared to step into the fray, he lingered for one more second, his lips pressing a hard, bruising kiss to my temple. It was a brand, a promise that he would tear the world down before he let a single shard of glass touch my skin.
The aftermath of the Blood Gala had left the estate in a state of hypervigilance, but the silence inside Jiwon's private study was of a different kind. It was heavy, expectant, and thick with the scent of old paper and wood smoke. Jiwon had been called away to deal with the fallout of the attack, leaving me to wait in the sanctuary of his inner sanctum. I paced the length of the room, my nerves still humming with the ghost of his touch, until my hip caught the edge of his massive mahogany desk. A drawer was slightly ajar, a sliver of white cardstock peeking through the dark wood. It was a lapse in his usual, surgical precision, or perhaps in the chaos he had finally left a door unlocked. I pulled the drawer open, expecting ledgers or blueprints of the 3 districts. Instead, I found a leather portfolio, worn at the edges as if it had been handled daily for a lifetime. My breath hitched as I flipped it open. It wasn't just a file, it was a chronicle. There were candid photos of me at the fashion house from 6 months ago, photos of me laughing with friends at a cafe I used to frequent before Minho had isolated me. There was even a receipt from the florist where I'd bought lilies for a wedding that never happened, dated weeks before the gala. The opulent dread I had felt since entering this house solidified into something sharper, something more intimate. Jiwon hadn't just happened to be in the VIP lounge that night. He hadn't been a random shadow I stumbled upon in my moment of despair. He had been a predator lying in wait, watching the trap of my life close around me so he could be the one to provide the key. "You were never supposed to find that," a voice rasped from the doorway. I spun around, the portfolio clutched to my chest. Jiwon stood there, his silhouette framed by the hallway's dim light. He looked weary, his shirt stained with the soot of the evening's violence, but his eyes were burning with an intensity that pinned me to the spot. "You've been following me," I whispered, the realization trembling in my voice. The gala, the accidental meeting, it was all a script. You knew Minho was going to leave me. Jiwon walked toward me, the forced proximity feeling like a physical cage as he trapped me between the desk and his body. He didn't look ashamed, he looked possessive. He took the portfolio from my hands and tossed it onto the desk, his fingers immediately finding the pulse point at my neck. "I didn't just know he was going to leave you, Shania. I made sure his options narrowed until he had no choice," he growled, his face inches from mine. "I watched him waste your light for a year. I waited for the moment you were broken enough to reach for a hand in the dark. I didn't help you by chance. I helped you because I decided long ago that you belonged in my world, not his." The truth was a cold, intoxicating nectar. He hadn't just saved me, he had hunted me. And as he leaned down to claim my mouth with a hunger that spoke of months of silent observation, I realized I didn't want to run. I wanted to see just how deep the dragon's obsession went. The skyline of Seoul glittered like a spilled box of jewels beneath the penthouse balcony. But the view that mattered most was reflected in the darkened glass of the sliding doors. I stood tall, the red velvet of my gown replaced by a dress of liquid obsidian that moved like smoke around my ankles. At my throat, the black diamonds Jiwon had gifted me felt less like a weight and more like an anchor. Below us, in the street-level grid that the elite usually ignored, a final act was playing out. Minho sat on the curb outside his family's seized estate, his head in his hands. The strategic merger had imploded under the weight of the forensic evidence Jiwon had leaked. The heiress had fled, and the bank accounts I once relied on were now as hollow as Minho's promises. He was a ghost in his own city, a man who had traded a queen for a shadow and lost both. I felt Jiwon step up behind me, his presence a warm, familiar shroud. He didn't say a word as he draped his arms around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. His thumb traced the line of my jaw, moving upward to touch the dragon's tail on his own neck. The forced proximity that had once terrified me was now my greatest strength. "The debt is settled, Shania," he murmured, his voice a low, lethal purr against my ear. "He has nothing left, not even a name." "He has his regret," I replied, watching the flickering blue lights of the police cars in the distance, just like I asked. I turned in his arms, looping my hands around his neck, my fingers grazing the ink and the hidden scars that told the story of his survival. I wasn't the expatriate looking for a seat at the table anymore. I was the one who owned the room. The opulent dread of the Lim Syndicate had become my heartbeat, a rhythm of power and possessiveness that suited me better than any socialite's title ever could. "You were right about the price of the throne," I whispered, pulling him closer until there was no space left between the predator and his prize. "It's a heavy weight to carry." Jiwan's smile was dark, a flash of white in the moonlight. He caught my waist, lifting me slightly until our eyes were level. "It's only heavy if you carry it alone, but the King of Soul doesn't rule an empty castle." He kissed me then, a deep territorial claim that tasted of victory and the dark promises of the night. Behind us, the servers in the war room continued to hum, processing the data of an empire that was now as much mine as it was his. I had started this journey wanting to make one man regret leaving me. I ended it by making an entire city realize I was the only woman they should have feared. The girl who cried in the VIP lounge was a memory. The Queen of Obsidian had arrived, and by Jiwan's side, I would ensure that the Shadows of Soul never stopped whispering my name.